morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing brought to you by the Kenan-Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Associate Rob Knapp, and it's great to have you with us this morning. So I've had a 4-day work week this week, and I suppose a lot of you have had that too. The last 3 days have been pretty busy. Maybe it's been the same way for you. Not as busy as it's been on Capitol Hill, though. Congress has spent its 3 days getting a debt ceiling package of legislation ready for the president to sign. So, crisis averted, right? Debt ceiling crisis averted. Well, our executive director, Greg Brown, says maybe not. He's going to be along in a moment to talk to us about that. And he's also going to talk to us about the road back to financial or fiscal responsibility. So worth tuning in for today. He's also going to take a look at the jobs numbers we've just received, which, stop if you've heard this before, are much, much bigger than had been predicted. And he'll touch on a couple of other salient topics as well. After that, he's going to be ready for your questions. As always, we ask you to submit your questions, and you can do that anytime during the briefing, including now, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are tuning in by phone today, you can email me your questions. I'm at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We do give priority to questions from members of the press. So if you are with the press, please include your title and organization for us. Thanks on that. We are going to try to finish things up at 9:30 sharp today because our speaker has someplace to be, as you'll find out soon. So will you please welcome our executive director, Greg Brown, who is coming to us today from the Rizzo Center here in Chapel Hill, where he'll be speaking this morning at a conference on wealth inequality put on by the Kenan-Institute and the Kenan-Flagler Business School. Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. We know you've got a busy day too, so I will turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Rob. And good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over the numbers that just came out, a little bit for what that means for the current economic outlook, what it may mean for monetary policy decisions, and then spend a little bit of time discussing my views on the current fiscal priorities and the debt ceiling deal, and perhaps looking a little bit longer term at how we should be thinking about fiscal policy in the U.S. right now, given it's the topic du jour. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully you all can see that. Let me know if you can't, Rob. But yeah, another barn burner employment report on the establishment side. So the expected change in non-farm payrolls was around 200,000. We actually got 339 on top of that. We had April revisions that were quite strong. This is, again, a number that is well above the sort of long run monthly change in non-farm payrolls. So typically at this stage in the cycle, we would be wanting to see something in the 100,000 range as sort of roughly on par with what labor force growth and population growth would be. And
hey, Greg, you'll want to check. We're not seeing your screen.
All right, let me try that again.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
There we go.
Okay. Sorry about that. Why it didn't take. But the overall, the establishment survey, which is really considered the more reliable one, just showed very strong payroll growth again. A couple little spots of weakness. So change in manufacturing payrolls that was negative, just slightly. The cause there was a decline in non-durable manufacturing. That number is a fairly modest number. It's often thought as a leading indicator for what's happening, especially in sort of the heartland type of industries. But I don't think it's a sign of anything, especially when you put it in context of the broad increase in payrolls. There was a little bit of weakness in IT too, but we know the story there, that there's sort of a continued hangover from excess hiring among large tech sector folks. And so, again, put that in the context of very strong above trend job growth. And I don't think there's sort of a sign of weakening labor markets overall when we look at the payrolls number. The average hourly earnings on a month-to-month basis were right in line with expectations. A little tick down in weekly hours, but it could be a rounding error in the core data. Unemployment rate did tick up from 3.5 to 3.7%. The unemployment rate comes from a different survey. That comes from the household survey. The household survey actually showed a decline in employment in May. But those numbers, because it's a much smaller sample, are sort of not statistically as reliable. And so when we see the unemployment rate bounce around a little bit, a few ticks, we don't read too much into it. You really need to get a few months of data to be able to establish a trend in terms of what's happening in labor force participation and unemployment rate from the household survey. So, those are numbers that are certainly important, and you want to put them in the context of what's happening cyclically in the economy. But I don't think the tick up in the unemployment rate is something that we should be concerned about, given how strong the much more reliable payrolls number has been. So let's think, just a little bit more about where we are, where things have evolved over the last year or so. Obviously, 21 was an extremely hot job market as people came back to work out of COVID. 22 also very strong, but we did see a cooling at the end of 22 and sort of a downward trend in the kind of moving average of payroll numbers. But look at what's happened just the last couple of months, right? So it looked like things were, sort of moving back towards what we would think of as a sustainable, long-run sustainable rate of job creation. But things have ticked back up again. So, we even saw an increase in the moving average, 3-month moving average of change in total non-farm employment. So, again, we'll talk a little bit more about what this means for monetary policy and broader economy. But I think it's safe to say that we're not seeing anything that looks like the economy dipping into a recession in Q2. Putting this in the context of kind of just total cumulative job creation since the pandemic. Last year we got back above pre-pandemic employment levels. We saw people starting to return more to the labor force. We've seen continued strong gains, and again, gains that are going to be very difficult to sustain in the long run without continued concerns of a even more overheating economy. If we look at the unemployment rate, we can see that even given that little tick up to 3.7%, we're still at what are historically very, very low unemployment rates. And in fact, if we look at the broader measure of unemployment, the so-called U6 measure, which includes people that are part-time for economic reasons, and this what economists call marginally attached to the labor force, it remained basically at a 50-year low. It ticked up 1/10, but off of again record low numbers. So there's really every indicator for the labor market is suggesting a very, very strong labor market, probably overheating labor market. And when we look at how people are participating in the labor market, there's been a lot of concern about people leaving the labor market around COVID, constraints to coming back in because of childcare reasons or other things. It looks like those are mostly behind us now. And if we look at overall civilian participation rate, so that's the blue line here, you can see that it's about back to where it was for the few years before COVID hit. So in the 2015 to 2020 range. And in fact, if we look at the prime labor force participation rate, so people that are aged 25 to 54, it's now ticked back up above that level. And the difference here, a lot of the difference here is people that retired during the COVID episode and sort of permanently left the labor force earlier than they would have without the COVID shock. So, it's again a indication that we continue to have an extremely strong labor market. The Fed has to be thinking about what this means in terms of policy, especially given that we've seen recently strong consumption growth and strong earnings growth and strong inflation growth that was more than expected in data we got earlier this week. If we look at it by gender, we can see that the labor force participation rate for women, which had been depressed for a while, has now exceeded its pre-COVID rate, and for men, it's basically back to where it was pre-COVID as well. So, how does this turn into pressures in the broader economy? Well, obviously, the number of people working affects the amount of earnings that the economy has overall. Those earnings turn into consumption. That consumption, if it exceeds production, leads to inflation. So we're very concerned about how things translate into the actual earnings and purchasing power. Again, the average hourly earnings have grown at a rate that is much higher than the long run historical rate. It's on par with the inflation rate. So the kind of real purchasing power of households hasn't grown much. But if we're expecting inflation to come down and the average hourly earnings stay this high, then we're going to see, on an inflation adjusted basis, growth in purchasing power, as inflation continues to moderate. So, it's the Fed, is probably more concerned about what the nominal growth is, this 4.3% growth rate, rather than what the inflation adjusted rate is, because inflation is higher than the Fed wants it to be. So, in my mind, we look at in the totality of the employment report and other recent data that we've gotten. It's really hard for me to see how this justifies the Fed stopping. If we look at what the futures market expects the Fed to do, they have gone from expecting the Fed to essentially be done a month ago to having at least one additional, potentially two additional rate increases over the summer, and the peak in rates to happen sometime late summer or fall. And this is a movie that we've seen again and again, which is it's just over the horizon for the Fed to stop raising rates, and it's always been a couple 3 months away, and here it is still a couple 3 months away. With a labor market that is so strong and with such persistently strong inflation, it's really hard for me to see how the Fed can justify a pause of any duration without significantly better information coming out on the inflation front. Inflation has really gotten persistently strong, and it's twice what the Fed wants it to be right now. And you can make arguments that there's forecasts that would predict moderating inflation, but that doesn't change the fact that we remain at twice the inflation rate that the Fed wants, and the evidence suggests that it's increasingly persistent at that very strong rate. So, when I think about Fed policy, I think about it in sort of the sense of a Taylor rule, which is where is the Fed cyclically relative to inflation, and on an interest rates that are adjusted for inflation as well. And historically, there is a pretty strong correlation between the inflation adjusted Fed funds rate and the employment rate. So the employment rate is just one minus the unemployment rate. And so typically when you would have an employment rate that was around 95%, you'd have a real Fed funds rate that was 3-4% or so. That changed after the global financial crisis, and the Fed maintained a very accommodative monetary policy. It, of course, got ridiculously accommodative during the COVID crisis, and now we're back to a Fed policy that is just very slightly restraining when you look at it in a historical context on an inflation-adjusted basis. So in this sense, while the Fed has tightened rapidly, when we think about it on an inflation-adjusted basis, that rapid tightening was really just to get us back to essentially a neutral monetary policy stance. And if we think of the longer-term history being the guide for what the Fed needs to do, they could still have another, % or two of tightening that they need to do to get us back to the historical precedents. So maybe that's the bad news. Hate to have a Friday with all bad news, but I think there are some silver linings in the data that we've seen over the last year or so. If we look at where unemployment has come down the most, it's come down in places where there's been historically higher unemployment rates. And in particular, if we look at rates by race, we can see that Black and Hispanic unemployment rates, which have historically been higher than the rates for whites and Asians, have really fallen dramatically. And in fact, we're at the lowest unemployment rate for Black workers in the history of collecting data. If we look at it by educational attainment, we can also see that there's been much stronger gains for workers at the lower end of educational attainment. So those that have less than a high school or just a high school degree have seen substantially larger declines in unemployment than college-educated workers. So with that, I want to provide just a little bit of additional thoughts on what's been happening around the debt ceiling. Obviously, a lot of drama, a lot of press coverage as to what was happening with the debt ceiling negotiations. I think rightfully so. It was considered a manufactured crisis. It's something everybody saw coming. There wasn't some unexpected shock to the budget, either on the spending side or on the revenue side, that caused this. And I think it was really just an opportunity, especially for those fiscal conservatives, to continue to make the point about fiscal irresponsibility that's happening in Washington. And I guess in some ways I'm sympathetic to that. We are in a very bad fiscal situation in the U.S. right now. If we look at the budget deficit, it's about 5% of GDP. It's projected to grow over the next decade to more than 6% of GDP, given the current fiscal policy. And the total debt that the U.S. has, that's held by the public, is currently around 100% of GDP, and expected to grow to about 120% of GDP over the next decade. And I think most economists, and there's debate about this in terms of what's the debt capacity of a country like the U.S., but there's I think a decent body of empirical research that suggests when you get to levels around 100% of GDP, this is where you can really see distortive effects of public debt. And it's something that can weigh on the economy in a very broad sense. In a long-term sense, it's crowding out of private capital. It's something that leads to lower long-term investment in the economy, and that leads to lower growth rates. And you can end up in sort of a vicious circle in terms of having an economy that is relying more and more on budget deficits in order to stimulate growth or keep the economy going, racking up deficits and leading to slower growth. So these aren't things that happen over a year or two or three. They're things that happen over decades. But I think part of the responsibility of the government is to think about what's going to happen over the next decade or two. So how do we think about what the debate is? In my personal opinion, one of the luxuries of being a chaired professor is I can call it as I see it. I think both sides are sort of living in a fiscal fairyland. The fiscal conservatives, I sympathize with them in terms of their desire to move back to a more realistic fiscal policy, but their desire to do it through essentially only cutting discretionary spending programs is just not feasible. That's not where the growth. That's not where the problems are, and that's not where the growth is in terms of deficit spending. Most of the deficit spending that is growth in deficit spending that's projected to happen over the next decade is going to come from Social Security, from Medicare and Medicaid programs, and from an increase in interest expense. So, as the Fed has moved from a very low interest rate policy to a higher interest rate policy, that directly affects the borrowing costs of the U.S. and directly impacts the deficit. That's interest that the federal government has to pay, and exacerbates the fiscal problem facing the country. So, realistically, there is no way to cut discretionary spending to the point that you're actually going to be able to solve the fiscal problem. So in that sense, you have to be a bit more courageous and think about how do we look at Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and tackle those problems either on the spending side or on the revenue side. I think that those on the left and the far left are also in sort of a fantasy land in terms of thinking that you're going to be able to raise taxes on just the rich or on businesses and be able to solve, the budget problem. The rich don't have enough money, and if you raise corporate taxes substantially, that puts us back in the situation we were in, a decade ago, where U.S. Corporate tax policy was not competitive with the rest of the developed world. And so, we were seeing essentially corporate flight out of the U.S. Because of prohibitively high corporate taxes. So again, the reality is that on the revenue side, if you're going to look at a solution that has to do with taxes, you're going to have more broad-based increase in taxes. So what is the right solution? The right solution is probably some very courageous people in the middle, taking a lot of political risk and saying, hey, listen, we need to think about a broader based approach to cutting spending and a broader based approach to raising revenue, and do that sooner rather than later, hopefully in a way that doesn't tank the economy. It's not a bad time to have some fiscal tightening cyclically because the economy is so strong right now. You would much rather do that when you have an unemployment rate under 4% than when you have sort of a neutral rate or a recessionary rate of unemployment. No one ever likes having higher taxes and lower benefits coming from the government, but we need to start thinking about realistically what we're going to do to prevent an exploding federal deficit over the next decade or two. So with that sober reality check in terms of what we should be thinking about in terms of fiscal policy, happy to kind of open it up to questions. And Rob, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much. I think that you and Christian have maybe started a new segment here, Straight Talk on the Debt with Christian and Greg, and Gerald. We'll give him his chance too. So something more for folks to tune in for every month. A couple of questions straight off. This one from Lauren Onesorge of the Triangle Business Journal. How should CEOs in the Raleigh area be looking at these numbers? What should their takeaway be?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the local economy here, we've been stronger than average over the recovery of the last couple of years. Unemployment rate in the Triangle has been below the national average. It's industry specific. What's been happening is, as I mentioned, we continue to see a slight decline in IT related jobs. So I think it really is more of an industry story. If you are in the IT industry, maybe you're going to benefit a little bit from the softening in the labor market if you're trying to hire right now. But if you're in a broader service industry where the labor market remains very tight, then you're looking at an economy that continues to have very strong prospects going forward. And I mean, if I were a CEO, I would also be thinking about what the outlook is on the financial side, and in terms of, for example, cost of borrowing. I honestly believe the Fed's got more to go than what people are currently projecting, and they're going to stay there for a while. So higher cost of debt for longer.
Okay. This one's from Dan Barkin at Business North Carolina. He says the number of persons not in the labor force who currently want a job was 5.5 million in May, little different from the prior month. These individuals were not counted as unemployed because they were not actively looking for work during the 4 weeks preceding the survey or were unavailable to take a job. What do we know about that 5.5 million?
Yeah, and I mean, it's always hard to figure out exactly the right way to measure unemployment, and in fact, different countries do it different ways. The U.S. has for a long time said we're only going to count people in sort of the headline so-called U4 unemployment rate if you've actively sought work in the last month. But there is this large pool of people that would potentially be working under other certain circumstances, right? And there's a wide range of circumstances. They might want to have more work or better work. They might be someone who can swing in and out of the labor force based on family conditions, family care, child care conditions, things like that. So people who would maybe want to have a job and don't have a job, or want more work and not. So trying to understand what's happening with that group is an important part of trying to understand more broadly what's happening in the labor market. Now that group, and that's why I highlighted this U6 number. So this U6 number is one that's really considered the broadest, easy to track number for unemployment rates. And that number remains extremely low by historical standards. So you take all those reasons that people might not be able to work and that are not looking for work, but might want to work. You take and you add all those up, and it's a large number, right? It's millions of people, but on a relative basis, it's very low. It's about as low as we've ever seen in the U.S. in terms of a percentage basis.
And just to kind of tag on to that question, and in terms of looking for a little good news on a Friday morning, it seems like it wasn't that long ago that we were looking at the labor participation number and saying, what's happened? When is this going to change?
Right.
That seems to have turned around. What were the major forces that drove that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly these issues around family care. Child care was a big one, especially keeping women out of the labor force because they end up more often than not being the one responsible for child care in a household. And so, I think as school normalized, as child care, other forms of paid child care markets normalized some, then that allowed women to come back into the labor force. So that was certainly one big contributor. The other is just how abundant jobs are. So there may be that some people, for whatever reason, feel that that they have a minimum wage that they're willing to work for, and when unemployment is high and their labor doesn't have as much bargaining power, they weren't able to get that wage. They weren't able to get that job that they wanted. But then, as things tightened up and the demand for labor increased, they were able to get that wage. So there's sort of a self-reinforcing mechanism there that will oftentimes have people join the labor force, and it's kind of what you'd expect, right? It's a supply and demand story where price is the equilibrating mechanism. As wages go up, that's going to pull more people into the labor force.
Okay, thanks. Interesting dynamic. This from David Mildenberg. How concerned do you believe is the Fed about fragility of the banking system? Could 1 to 2 more rate hikes this summer lead to more banks tipping over, given out of the money investment portfolios?
Yeah, no, it's really hard to know what's happening in banking right now. The shocks that we saw so far seem to be related to very poor risk management at the banks, and at a very fundamental level, banks have a maturity mismatch between their assets and their liabilities. Their assets tend to be longer term, their liabilities tend to be shorter term. That's always been the case. It's always been something that led to fragility in the banking system, but it's something that for decades now has been relatively easy to manage because you could use interest rate swaps or other types of derivative products. And well-managed banks, those with good, careful risk management, understand that exactly, and they're not essentially speculating on the yield curve, right? They're understanding that maturity mismatch and managing it in a way that's prudent based on the liabilities that they have. That was not happening at the banks that faced trouble. So in some ways, that was a risk management error. It was a maturity mismatch between assets and liabilities. It wasn't that the underlying assets that the banks held were bad credit, right? And in fact, a lot of the assets they held were government bonds, right? But government bonds, are going to decline in price when interest rates go up, just like any bond. And so that was what we've seen so far. The bigger concern, the bigger risk, is what's happening on the credit side of these portfolios. And the biggest concern there, I think, is what's going to happen to commercial real estate, right? There's maybe some credit risk in residential real estate, and some of the issues with Republic Bank were related to maybe some credit risk on these kind of exceptionally large mortgages that they made. But the much bigger credit risk here is what's going to happen to commercial real estate. And there's a lot of concern about especially office properties, things that people thought were very stable, low credit risk assets because they had 5-year leases, were nearly leased up, existing properties, kind of high quality assets from a historical basis. But now, we're hearing all these stories about offices that are largely vacant in some markets, that people are not renewing leases. And so over the next year or two, there's going to be potentially substantial pressure on what's happening to segments in the commercial real estate market. And these loans are going to potentially mature. So they're going to be able to kind of put things off for a while. But as leases renew, as loans mature, we're potentially going to be in a situation where there's a lot of credit risk on banks, and the Fed needs to be concerned about that. They need to be getting a handle on that, and I'm sure they are in terms of how big a risk that is. And my guess is that's a bit of a slower moving risk, and there's still this notion that given how hot the economy is right now, what do they need to be doing in terms of monetary policy to have the economy kind of move back to a position where there's not going to be these strong inflationary pressures driven largely by an overheated labor market. So while I think there are these longer term concerns in terms of the credit risk that the Fed is going to have to pay attention to, the short term crisis, hopefully around kind of asset liability management has worked out, and they're aware of those issues, and banks have if there's remaining banks out there that have those sort of basic risk management issues, that those are easier to get a handle on because you can just see what the essentially the market value of your assets are. So that in my mind is not going to be enough to stop the Fed in the short run, and the market's pricing in higher rates, and I think the Fed may be underestimating that, or maybe it's bifurcated in the sense that there's people like me that see the opportunity for much higher rates, and then other people worried about the economy tipping into a recession in the near term. I still feel, and Gerald and Christian, I think we probably have quite similar views on this, that we are going to have a recession. And is it the always 6 months away recession? It probably is 6 months out because of just how much demand there is in the market right now, labor market, for example, how many more job postings there are than available workers, for example. So there's still the opportunity for the economy to run for a while, but even the bond market thinks the Fed is going to overdo it, right? So if you look at the trajectory for interest rates over the next 2 years, the futures market believes that the Fed is going to cut rates next year, which is something that would happen if the economy moved into a recession.
Okay, Greg, thanks. Excellent insight as always. I know there is a lectern or a moderator chair with your name on it somewhere in the Rizzo Center. Yes. So we will wind this up and let you go, but thanks again, much appreciated. Thanks also to the audience for their questions. Always great. We appreciate that too. For those folks in the media, thanks for joining us. If you would like to continue the conversation, we would love to as well. If you'd like to talk to Greg or any of our other experts about any of the topics that we cover, please reach out to me at rob_knapp at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. For everybody, we invite you to take a look at our website, Kenan-Institute.unc.edu. We always have a lot going on there. And in the next couple of weeks, we should have some information about the Wealth and Quality Conference that Greg is speaking at today. It's the first one of these we've done. We think there's a lot of interesting things being discussed there. And so we will bring you some reports and some video from that on our website. I think that is everything for today. We appreciate you tuning in. Hope everybody has a great Friday. We will be back here again on July 7th and hope to see you then. Thanks very much.